Jesus tells us another parable, and it's the parable of a house built on a rock or a house built on sand. And this story is about a person who is learning to
I got
obey
this, Bo.
and
No, I got
follow.
this. I got this one. Don't worry, I got this.
Okay.
Okay, so there's 3 little pigs, right?
Yeah.
And these 3 little pigs, they got to go and build their own houses.
No, Ben.
So one of them builds their house out of straw. One of them builds their house out of sticks.
Yeah.
And the last one builds his house out of stone.
Actually, no,
And
Ben,
then this wolf comes along, and he's like, "I'm gonna get into this house."
No.
And the pig says, "Nuh-uh."
Yeah.
And then I go, "I'm gonna huff, and I'm gonna puff, and I'm gonna blow your house down."
But in
and
the
he
parable that Jesus... Yeah.
and the house goes flying away, okay?
Right.
Then he goes to the second house
That's
with
so-
the sticks.
Yeah, but
all
the
right? And he
parable
goes,
that Jesus...
"Let me in." And the pig goes, "Nah!" And then he goes, "I'm gonna puff, and I'm gonna blow your house down."
Yes.
And he goes,
That's the parable. So
okay?
that's the story
And
of
then he goes to the third house.
All right, third house. In the
And he
parable-
says, "Let me in."
Sure, but
Okay?
that's the
And
parable.
the pig says, "No, I'm not gonna let you in." And the wolf goes, "I'm gonna huff, and I'm gonna puff, and I'm gonna blow your house down."
Ben, I think you should leave, go to cool down for a second. And that...
Fine.
Thanks for that. So, anyway, Jesus starts his parable by saying anyone who obeys his teachings is like somebody who has built their house on a solid foundation, on the rock, which means that they have built their life on what Jesus teaches, and they are trusting in whatever he has told us to do.
Does anybody remember the level of intensity that Chris Farley had? Hey everybody, I'm Nate, and if I haven't met you, it's an honor that you're here. Thanks for being here. Thanks to everybody who's joining online or listening later in the week. So we started a series a couple weeks ago on some of the parables of Jesus, and we've just been in one chapter of the Bible, Matthew chapter 13, where Jesus tells multiple parables. We're going to cover 3 of them today. So what was a parable? A parable was a teaching tool that Jewish rabbis used frequently in the first century. And it was a way to infuse everyday experiences with meaning. So a parable is a story with intent. And so Jesus tells parables, and there's multiple reasons he does it. One would be the capacity to remember truth, right? So our brains typically think in terms of narrative, and this is why, especially indigenous cultures that didn't necessarily have capacity to write things down, you told stories about your people. And those stories were easy to remember, and they transferred values to the next generations. Well, Jesus does this in part because nobody has a Bible that they can take home. Printing presses and paper that was economical are centuries away from being invented. And so he tells these stories so people could wander away and think. Parables are also meant to have multiple levels of understanding. So at one point, you understand a parable, but as you read it, you find, oh, there's a depth and a breadth to this that could take me years and years to explore. So at the beginning of Matthew chapter 13, you'll find if you have a Bible that puts Jesus' words in red, like almost all of the chapter is red because it's one parable after another. So we're going to read the final 3 parables. 2 are about some unique things about the kingdom. The third one is, in my opinion, the most cryptic parable there is. We're going to have to do a little work to try to understand what that's about. And then Matthew concludes the chapter with an illustration, all right? So 2 weeks ago, we learned about the idea that the kingdom of God is like a sower who sows seed. So one of the things that Jesus wants people to understand is when he came to earth, he's bringing a new reality. It's a brand new reality. He calls it his kingdom, and he's introducing this idea that God is still spreading truth. It's like seeds. And where it drops into our lives, the conditions of our life, that's everything. Because we can be hard-hearted or we can be shallow in terms of our soil. He says what God wants to do is he's creating a new Eden. He's creating a new reality for human beings. And as God, the distributor of truth, plants it into our life, it's up to us to embrace it and see it grow, because God's kingdom is fruitful. It's about life. It's about reproduction. It's about health. It's about things that we're bearing coming to life. And then last week we looked at another parable, almost the same, but it had seeds that were sown by Jesus. And then there were counterfeit seeds that were sown by the enemy, diablos. Jesus uses that term, the devil. And then two things sprout up together, but they're nearly indistinguishable. Real wheat and the tares. The bearded darnel is the official name of the plant. And what do? And Jesus says, one of the things you want to understand about the kingdom is you want to understand that God's the judge. That when things grow up, counterfeit and the real within the kingdom, leave it up to God to deal with the counterfeit. He knows how to do that. It's not my responsibility. Now, the next couple parables we're going to read are very short. There's just a few sentences, but they're going to talk to us about the kingdom. Ready? Matthew chapter 13. We'll start at verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. So why would you hide it again? Because he doesn't own the field, right? And so man, I'm going to hide it because if I take it away, whoever owns the field is going to say, no, that was on my property. So he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. All right, let's take a second. We're going to talk a little bit about lessons about the kingdom. Okay, lessons about the kingdom. I know that's just a few sentences, but what is Jesus communicating about his new reality? Well, first thing is this. The kingdom is a brand new reality. It's brand new. When Jesus talks about kingdom, in large part, he's saying this. Jesus has come to start something new on planet Earth, to recreate what has happened. And he is now the king, King Jesus. And he won his kingdom not the way that everyone anticipated, not through dominance, not through chasing out the Roman Empire, not by sitting on a throne, but he won his kingdom through love and sacrifice. He brought a new reality where human beings who had been distant from their creator could now come into relationship with their creator, and Jesus would be king. And so Jesus is inviting people into this new reality, inviting them into surrender to his teaching, surrender to his leadership, surrender to his kingship. And in this new kingdom, this new reality, everything's different. The reason for behavior is different. You're not trying to earn approval, but you're trying to express your love for your king. That's why you act a certain way. In the kingdom is a new set of values. In the kingdom is a new set of ethics. In Jesus' kingdom, he has a couple of rules. He says, I want you to love God with everything you have, and I want you to love people. Loving God, loving people. Those are the dynamics of this new kingdom, where when you look at people, they're not bothersome, they're not competition, they're not commodities. Jesus says, in my kingdom, people are going to love one another. We're reestablishing shalom, peace here on planet Earth. So the kingdom's a new reality. In these parables, though, here's a few things that Jesus says about the kingdom. First, he talks about the worth of the kingdom. So there's two different things that are very valuable. One is buried treasure, and the second is a pearl. And both of things are incredibly valuable. And the first one is a treasure hunter, right? I've never done this, but I have enjoyed watching people with metal detectors, like in a park. What are you doing? You're looking for something valuable that's been lost or buried or no one else has found. And so there's a guy who's been looking for treasure, and he finds it. And when he starts to dig around it, he realizes this is worth everything. The value is infinite. And then the second is a merchant who deals in pearls. So for us, that's kind of a funny term, right? But pearls in the ancient world were incredibly valuable. In fact, Roman women who were in the upper echelons of society, one of the ways that you showed your wealth was through pearls, just because they were very hard to come by. They're this naturally reoccurring thing. You know, it all starts with a grain of sand and an oyster and develops and grows. And they didn't have capacity to dive. But there's a merchant he doesn't just want pearls. He's looking for fine pearls. And one day he's at a marketplace and he sees the pearl. It is the pearl that he has been looking for his entire life. And it's worth so much that he sells everything. He doesn't even have the resources to buy that pearl at that moment. So he sells everything and comes back with his entire life savings to buy that one pearl. The treasure hunter sells everything. He says, if I can just own this plot of land, I'd sacrifice everything in order to own the treasure that's buried. So Jesus is talking about the worth or the value of the kingdom. Another thought that Jesus is giving us in this is something about seeking in the kingdom. He says to seek the kingdom. So the parables aren't a guy was walking and stepped on something and turned around and he found a buried treasure. It wasn't a guy who just was, cleaning his house and he's like, oh, there's a pearl. Both individuals in this story are doing what? They're proactively seeking. And there's something about the kingdom where there's this invitation from Jesus to be somebody who's always seeking what it means for Jesus to be king. Who's always seeking not the traditional, not the normal way of doing things, not the normal way of thinking or acting or behaving, but there's this spiritual hunger in our lives. In fact, just 7 chapters before this, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says this, I want you to seek first the kingdom of God. Seek first. So it's this idea of a priority. I don't find the kingdom, I don't establish Jesus as king in my life if I'm passive. It just doesn't happen. I don't achieve the kingdom, but I'm invited to seek the kingdom. And then this last dynamic about the kingdom is the kingdom has to be secured in both of these parables. So it's secured how? Well, you got 2 people who are willing to sell everything. Complete liquidation in order to find that one pearl, in order to own that one plot of land with the treasure. So there's this idea of you stumble on it, you find it because you're seeking and you understand its worth, but then you're willing to engage and say, this is so valuable that I would secure the kingdom in my life by turning away, by giving up on everything else to pursue this one thing. So as I was thinking through this, I was thinking about how that applies to my life, how that applies to your life. And I thought of 3 different categories of people that would be here, would be listening. And that we kind of sometimes migrate between these. First would be long-term disciples, which is a follower of Jesus. And I just want to speak to you for a moment about the kingdom. If you've been following Jesus for a while, I don't know why this happens, but you can become jaded. I've experienced this, where you're amazed by the kingdom. When you first learned that Jesus could be king, when you first learned that you were loved and forgiven, and it's everything to you, but if you give it enough time and you quit seeking the kingdom, and you quit securing the kingdom in your life, and you forget about the worth of the kingdom, that beauty, that awe begins to dissipate in your life. One of the reasons I love baptisms is we just watched that man be baptized. And it reminds me of the moments when I experienced the kingdom for the first time in that sense of awe and forgiveness, and I'm included in the family of Jesus, and I have a king that I serve. And so any of us who have been walking with Jesus for some time, as you read these two parables, remember the value of the kingdom. Remember to be a seeker of the kingdom. Remember to secure the kingdom. A second group of people would be this. Everybody who is searching right now, you're spiritually unresolved. I love that you feel safe to come into this church or to listen online. And I think Jesus was saying this through the parables to you. If you're walking through your doubts and your uncertainties and the teachings of Jesus, and you're drawn towards it, but you're not sure, and like, do I really want to surrender my life to King Jesus? Because there are consequences involved. I think Jesus writes this parable to you to say, it's worth it. It's worth it. Seek the kingdom, secure the kingdom. You won't have regrets. And then the third group of people, I think, especially in our culture, we emphasize belief, which is definitely a part of the teachings of Jesus. But there's this static thing where we ask people to just believe. Will you believe? Do you believe that Jesus is who he said he is? Do you believe that Jesus died on the cross? That's very important. But Jesus was always asking people to move beyond belief and to move into following. Okay, the word is disciple. And I think these two parables are written to us that would say, yeah, I believe. And the good news about that is your eternity is secure. You've resolved some important things. But Jesus is saying, I don't want you to just believe. I want you to be so enamored and drawn to the kingdom that you follow King Jesus. You don't just bow your knee and say, yeah, he's king, but you follow him. You become a disciple of King Jesus. And sometimes we stay here just in a point of belief because we know there's a cost involved in following Jesus. And we're like, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Like, I believe my eternity is secure, and I know that he wants me to follow him, but if I follow him, that means I leave certain things. I was reminded this week of 1519. Cortez came to what we call Mexico today. He and his men had this arduous journey across the ocean. You can imagine like how difficult that is. And by the time they found the New World, all his men wanted to go back. They're like, we're done. Like, that was a horrible journey. We just want to go back. And so Cortez, fearing mutiny, and Cortez is motivated. His motivations weren't necessarily pure, but he was enamored with the New World. He was enamored with stories of cities built with gold. And so Cortez gets all his men off the ship, and then he sends 10 men back, and they burn all the ships. They burn them. Can you imagine you just cross the Atlantic Ocean, and you can't, or like you're just thinking about going home, and you look out, and like, you just burned our ride home. Why'd you do that? Because if you burn the ships, you have to engage with the future because there's no way back. And that term has been used by generals and by coaches over the years, like burn the ships. But there's something about that moving from belief to discipleship is, for some of us, Jesus is saying the kingdom is so significant. You need to burn the ships. The things that give you safety and security so that you can begin the journey of discipleship. So the kingdom, it's a new reality. It has incredible value. We're called to seek it and we're called to secure it. All right, there's 4 little truths about the kingdom from those 2 parables. Now, let's move on. Jesus is going to tell a story about a net and fishing. We've kind of covered that in the previous weeks. But we're going to move on to this really cryptic little parable that starts with a question, okay? It's a question. Jesus asked this question, do you understand? Do you understand? Let's go ahead and read. Have you understood all of these things? Okay? Because he's taught a lot. And twice in Matthew 13, the people have said, we don't understand. And Jesus said, that's fine. Let me explain it to you. And yes, they replied. Now, towards the end of the chapter, they're like, yeah, we're starting to get it. And he said to them, here it is. Therefore, every teacher of the law, the term there is often translated as scribe. So some of our Bibles might say every scribe, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. And that's the end of the parable. Like, okay, I kind of got the treasure, I kind of got the pearl, but now you're telling us one more parable, and it's about every scholar, every scribe in the kingdom who has become a disciple is like someone who owns a house, and they bring out of the storeroom treasures that are ancient and valuable, but also treasures that are new and are valuable. What is he getting at? What is he getting at? Well, Jesus will say similar things at other times. At one point, he'll say this, I want you to think about the kingdom like wineskins. Now, we have no reference for that, right? But in the ancient world, wine was really important because most of the time, water was so toxic you couldn't drink it. So creating wine was actually a way to have safe things to drink. And so you had a fermenting process, but with fresh wine, new wine, you had to put it in an animal skin for a period of time to store it. But here's what was so important. You took new wine and you put it in animal skin, but it wasn't completely done fermenting. And so during that fermenting process, you would have to have a new wineskin because the new one had the capacity to stretch as the fermenting process goes on. If you took new wine and used a previously used wineskin, you would put it into a wineskin that had already been stretched, and now it's already been stretched, and so it would not have any capacity, so it would burst, and you lose it all. So Jesus says this, he says, here's something you gotta understand about my kingdom, is it's expanding and it's growing, and you have to have new ways of thinking. You have to have some elasticity. You have to have some adaptability in order to stretch with this growing kingdom that I'm bringing. If you have an old, withered up concept of who God is and what he's doing, if you put the new kingdom in, it'll go beyond your capacity. And so Jesus says this about the parable. He goes, every scribe. So what is a scribe? What is a teacher of the law? Well, we're first kind of introduced to this concept in an ancient Hebrew book called the Book of Ezra. Here's what happens in the book of Ezra in part. The nation has been carried away into captivity. Nobody's been home for years and years and years. The city of Jerusalem has fallen into complete disrepair. And so there's a man named Nehemiah who comes back. He's a part of the Babylonian king's court, but he's a Jew. And he comes home and he says, I'm gonna rebuild the walls. So there's a structural rebuilding that needs to happen. But simultaneously, there's this man named Ezra who is a scribe. And Ezra goes back and he says, well, okay, we need new walls. We need structural rebuilding. But what we need more than anything is we need a spiritual renewal. Because we read this, everybody had forgotten who God was. In fact, there's this period of time where they cannot find a single copy of Moses' letters. This is what their entire culture was built around. And it's just been lost. But then there's this man named Ezra who finds one final copy. And this is what a scribe did. A scribe was responsible for the text, the ancient Old Testament text. A scribe was involved in copying old copies as perfectly and accurately as possible. We're told that it could take something about like 10 years to copy just 4 of the books of Moses because it was so meticulous. You did not want to make a mistake copying the Bible. They were also responsible for dealing with old texts that had become unreadable just through decay. So they actually took them out into the desert and buried them because what do you do with an old Bible, right? A little confusing. And so these scribes then became not only the people who kept the text, but then they taught the text. And Ezra is a teacher of the law. Now Jesus says, okay, in my new kingdom, here's one more parable. I'm going to have people who are keepers of my words. And they're going to be like someone who has a house, and in the house is a room full of treasures. Some of them are old, ancient treasures that were passed on to us from previous generations. But there are also new treasures that Jesus is bringing. He's bringing a new way of understanding God, right? This is the Old Testament way. They've got it like, okay. He says, but I'm bringing in some new treasures, some new concepts, some new ways of thinking about God. And if you want to be in my kingdom, you're going to have to be a little bit more elastic. You're going to have to be a little bit more adaptable, because if all you can think about is what was, you won't be able to embrace what now is, what I am doing. And you don't disregard the old, but you hold on to the old and you embrace the new. And this was the challenge that so many people had in the first century when they listened to Jesus. They're like, wow, he's amazing, but it's different than what we knew. This is why the majority of people rejected him, because we know what was, we're comfortable with that. But Jesus is asking us to consider some new things. And not many people were willing to create new wineskins and say, I can contain the old and the new. So Jesus actually, right after what we read, he's going to travel back to his hometown. And I think Matthew includes this at the very end of chapter 13 as an illustration of this last parable we just read. So Jesus is going back to Nazareth, where he grew up. Okay, so this is like, anybody ever been to a high school reunion many years afterwards? Such a weird experience. We went to one, was it like our 20th or 25th? And like you look at everybody and they look so old. And then you realize, that's how I look too. And I just like, things are awkward. And there's this one guy I felt like I've needed to apologize to for years and years and years. And like I psyched myself up. I was going to apologize to him. He wasn't there. Tried to find him on the internet, can't. So Jesus is going back home. He's been away for years. This is an illustration of this old and new. If you want to be a part of his kingdom, you've got to be able to embrace both. When Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue. That's a gathering place where they would meet weekly on Saturdays. And they were amazed. Their initial experience when they hear Jesus teach is, wow, this guy, he's so wise. This guy talks about God as if he knew him. This guy makes sense of passages of scripture that we've never been able to comprehend. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? So this word, we translated that early on, like 1511. It's the word teknon in Greek, and it's somebody who works with their hands. And so originally when we read that, we thought, it meant carpenter. But here's the thing, in Israel, there's basically no wood. There's no carpenters. It was a mason, somebody who was a laborer. And so they begin to think, they hear Jesus, but then they're like, wait a minute. Isn't this the son of the guy that helped build our house? Isn't this the son of the guy who built that stone fence for us? How could he be so wise? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And this would have been a slam right here, because Mary was considered to have started off her life by having an illegitimate child, right? Hey, we kind of know about his mom. And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? So they start asking, like, he was educated in the same school as we were. He went to the same synagogue. Where did all of this come from? And they took offense at him. They are not ready for the new things that Jesus is introducing. They're really comfortable with the old thing. The old thing, Jesus, the carpenter's son. But Jesus is now claiming to be the Son of God. And they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. No. We're offended that a guy from our town, who we grew up with, who our kids went to school with, would say these things about himself. So they move from amazement to offense. Amazement to offense. And here's the result. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and in his own home. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Interestingly, in the Greek, it says he could not do many miracles there in his hometown because of their lack of faith. So here Matthew is giving us an illustration about this last parable, about the new scribe in the kingdom treasures both the old and the new and identifies both as valuable. Jesus goes home, and there's a group of people who initially go, whoa, man, this guy can teach. Astounding, beautiful. And then they start to remember who he is, and he is now living outside of the convenient theological box that they have created. No, God wouldn't do that. When the Messiah, the promised one, comes, he couldn't have been born to somebody like Mary. He couldn't have grown up in a little town where we grew up. His dad would have sat on the throne. His dad wouldn't have been a man who worked with his hands. And in a moment, they go from amazement to offense. And they're completely incapable of treasuring what's new. They're so committed to the old. They don't have room in their life for this new revelation of who God is and what he's doing on planet Earth. And guys, I would say this. I think all of us face this tension. I think, observation, the older you get, the harder it can be. I like this. I like the way we do things. I like the way we do church. I'm comfortable with that. And here's what I know. I guarantee you, there's like an 8-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy somewhere on the other side of this church campus right now who are digging for treasures and they're looking for pearls, and they're gonna find something that you and I have never been able to find. And 15, 20 years from now, they're gonna bring it to this church, and I'm gonna have to make a decision. Hip hop worship? Leave that one buried. I just wanna stay with what I know, right? But here's the deal, Jesus is always creating. He's always teaching. And so I hold on to the old. It's how I know what's accurate and true, but I want to be able to embrace the new, because here's what I do not want to have happen in your life or my life, that I move from amazement to offense. I want to be seeking the kingdom, understanding its value, because if I gravitate to that place where God hasn't lived up to my expectations, and I thought if I just followed Jesus, there wouldn't be any more pain or difficulty. Somebody told me that I'd be wealthy if I just followed Jesus, and I'm not there. I don't like what's happening in my life, and I become offended by Jesus. And here's what Jesus says: a life where you're offended is a life where miracles can't happen. When I'm offended by God, his miraculous power within me is incapacitated. I want to have a life. I want you to have a life, whether you're brand new in your journey with Jesus or you have been following him for years, where I think I know the old and I'm going to hold on to it and I treasure it, but I'm also choosing to absorb the new things that Jesus is doing, because he's still creating a new church. Now, I don't want to be committed to what was appropriate culturally. I want to be appropriate to what Jesus is doing here and now. I want to embrace all of that. I want our church, I want your life, I want my life to be an environment where God can do miraculous things, where I take my offense and I take my disappointment in God and I say, I don't know what to do this, so I surrender it to you. Because I want to be like that new scribe, that new teacher of the law in the kingdom, who holds on to what was and anticipates what is. I want to be that wineskin that is pliable, that whatever you pour into my life, I have the capacity to stretch with it, and I will not burst.